Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us from all over the world for our event, Avicenna, History of Public Health in Iran and Impacts on Modern Medicine. My name is Sheva Tabatabainejad. I'm an alumna of Georgetown School of Foreign Service, Persian Studies program, and have the honor of moderating today's event. As always, following our presentations, there will be a Q&A portion. Please use the Q&A chat box so that we may address your questions during the designated time. As always, questions are welcome in both Persian, English, or Finglish. I have the pleasure of introducing the founder and director of the Persian Studies program at Georgetown University, Professor Fatima Mostofi.
Ladies and gentlemen, salam. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our 210 attendees from around the globe. On behalf of the Persian Studies program of Georgetown University, I would like to welcome you to Avicenna, History of Public Health in Iran and Impacts on Modern Medicine, our first event in this fall semester and our sixth webinar in the Jolly News lecture series. We are grateful for your presence today and hope that you will enjoy learning from this cultural event. Let me also extend my gratitude to the Jolly News family, without whom these cultural events would not take place. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists, Dr. Hakima Amri and Dr. Willem, as well as our moderator, Mrs. Sheva Tabatabainejad. I turn it over to you, Mrs. Tabatabainejad.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ostad. I would like to go ahead and jump into introductions of our esteemed panelists. Dr. Flor and Dr. Amri, if you could just turn your video on for us. I will go ahead and introduce both of you. Dr. Hakima Amri is a professor of biochemistry and physiology at Georgetown University in the Department of Biochemistry and Cellular and Molecular Biology. Dr. Amri has a Master of Science degree in reproductive biology and a PhD in steroid biochemistry. As the co-founder of the Integrative Medicine Educational Initiative at Georgetown University School of Medicine, Dr. Amri has been the head of the Integrative Medicine and Health Sciences graduate program since its launch in 2003 and currently serves as the director of the Master of Science program. Dr. Amri's research is focused on bridging evidence-based integrative medicine and biomedical research. She has investigated the effects and molecular mechanisms of herbal products on prostate and breast cancer and the mechanisms underlying the effects of acupuncture in reducing stress. Her scholarly activities are represented by her published work in peer-reviewed journals, presentations at national and international conferences, and authorship of several book chapters, multiple reviews, as well as 2 books, Molecular Medicine and Avicenna's Medicine. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Amri.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today.
Excellent. Next, I will introduce our next panelist, Dr. Willem Flor. Dr. Flor is a historian, writer, and Iranologist. He studied economics, non-Western sociology, and Islamic studies before he became interested in Persian. The title of his PhD dissertation was The Guilds in Qajar, Persia, and ever since he has been engaged in Iranian studies. Throughout this time, he has published extensively on the socioeconomic history of Iran. Dr. Flor's books on Iran could be categorized into energy-related publications, Persian Gulf, art, social history, economic history, political history, and medical history. Some of his recent titles include Persian Pleasures, How Iranians Relaxed Through the Centuries, Food, Drink, and Drugs, and The Beginnings of Modern Medicine in Iran. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Flor. Excellent. And so for our first presentation, I will hand it off to Dr. Amri.
Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me and being part of this great event. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Do you see the slides?
We do.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the medical wisdom of the ancients, from Hippocrates to Avicenna to biomedicine. And as you can see, the title is basically for a full day of discussion, but I'm challenged today to cover all this in 15, 20 minutes. So I will do my best. The outline for today, as I prepared it, is we go through the historical context, collaboration and exchange of knowledge, contribution of those medical systems in the foundational framework of biomedicine, what is Greco-Romano-Arabo-Persian medicine or Unani medicine, or what is called today traditional Persian medicine, modern observations of the and medicine of the 21st century. So I will start by putting all this into context and saying that science is a continuum. So it started way back, 4,500 years. The knowledge was recorded on clay tablets by the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And there is a huge body of knowledge that's recorded and found in the Egyptian papyri. And then we have a lot that was developed in China, again, also in India, and of course in the Mediterranean region between ancient Greece and Rome, all the way to the medieval Islamic and Byzantine world. So this is the continuum, just to kind of put this into context again. And so it starts way back from the shamanic medicine to our modern civilization and our biomedicine today, going through all these different civilizations and great scholars and scientists and physicians from these different cultures. Imhotep from Egypt, Hammurabi, Asclepius, Homer, Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna, the topic of today's talk. In parallel, there were also all these bodies of knowledge growing, or taking place in China and India. This is a map, and it's really interesting when you draw a line from the Atlantic to the Pacific across all these countries. You see that Iran is really in the middle. It's really at the crossroad of the East and the West. And I think that contributed a lot to that, to preserving that body of knowledge. So after the fall of Rome, a little new knowledge was added in Europe during the Dark Ages. And the existing knowledge was copied and translated. So the knowledge of the Mediterranean basin and the Levant was preserved and improved upon by the Arab and Persian scholars. This is just an example of what was preserved and what was preserved back then. This is the Materia Medica of Dioscorides, who is a Roman physician who's going with the Roman army around and collecting all the herbs and writing down their medicinal benefits. And as you can see, the Materia Medica of Dioscorides was translated into Arabic. The other exchange that you can see is that in Chinese manuscripts, you find Arabic scripts. So that shows again the exchange between the cultures. Same thing, this is a list of Chinese herbs cited in Unani manuscripts. The continuum from ancient Egypt and Africa, Europe and Asia, with the different scholars and very well-known figures in these fields. Then here the Arabo-Islamic, from the Arabo-Islamic Empire, all the way from Spain to Persia, as I noted. So these are physicians well known: Al-Razi, Maimonides, Ibn al-Nafis, and we are going to talk more about Ibn Sina. Ibn Sina is, this is his name, born in Kharmaitan near Bukhara, and he's a Persian physician, started practicing medicine at a very, very early age. And he was also pharmacist, poet, physician, philosopher, statesman, and considered a genius basically by his peers. And his writings were translated and used all the way to the 17th century in Europe. This is his book, Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, or the Canon of Medicine, that was translated way back then into Latin in the 13th century and printed. There are 14 editions of this translation, and it was translated even before the Greek texts and used all the way until the 17th century in Europe. And this interest never faded, because that's what I translated to just a few years ago here in the United States. He's revered in many parts of the world, and these are postal stamps that were collected that were issued by several countries, as you can see here, to commemorate the millennial birthday of Avicenna. That was in 1980. That was the one from Algeria. And I like this quote: Avicenna links ancient physicians with modern medicine. His devotion to the search for truth set the standard for all times. The cultures of both East and West are indebted to this great physician and philosopher, which is very true. So now we move to the next point: contribution of those medical systems in the framework of today's science and medicine. So these are the concepts of pain as described by Avicenna. And you can see how it's very similar to what is used today in the McGill pain questionnaire. So that was in the 10th, 11th century, and that's what we are using today. Contribution again to modern medicine. This is a parallel comparison of what the symptoms or criteria, if you want, of hypertension, and how it was described in Al-Qanun fi al-Tibb, in the Canon of Medicine, which called Imtila. And you see again here the comparison, which is very, very close, very, very close. So what is Greco-Romano-Arabo-Persian medicine? What type of medicine was Ibn Sina practicing? So that's what we call Unani Tibb, and that's what how I'm going to refer to now. Unani medicine is a holistic, comprehensive medical system. It promotes the natural recuperative power of the body, which is the life force. It defines health as a balance of the elements, temperaments, and humors. It treats the causes, the root cause and origin of disease rather than symptoms. So it's divided into theoretical basis and practical. And basically that's how it is. It was a very systematized, structure, if you want, of medicine. And that's what we have today as physiology, pathophysiology, biochemistry, and all that, the theory of naturals. And this is the etiology of disease and the symptoms of disease. So this is a summary of the concepts of Unani medicine. You can see there is the theoretical, the practical, and we are going to talk more about the practical now, because many people are very aware of the prevention aspect of Unani medicine, and these are the 6 elements that we talk a lot about these days in our biomedical practices, which is the 6 elements, the 6 requisites for health. But I'm going to focus on other things today, which are how science kind of, explains these observations from Unani medicine. So the principles continue. The naturals are the elements, the temperaments, the humors, and the spirits. And actually, when I talk to the students about Unani medicine, I ask them, do you know what type of medicine Hippocrates was practicing back then? And of course, nobody knows really what it was. It was a humoral medicine. It was based on the elements, the balance of the elements, the humors, and of course, the temperaments. So these are the elements: earth, water, air, and fire. Each one has its own characteristics, and that constitutes the temperament. So that's how I visualized it in the book, because based on the description of Avicenna, that earth, water, and air are there, and they are the three of them are held together by fire. The temperaments, these are the physical properties, if you want, of the elements: hot, cold, wet, and dry. Each organ has its own temperament. And that's really very important observation as we know it today. Each temperament has a range. That's also very important because the body is not a static entity. The temperament determines the treatment of choice. Of course, that's what it's this state, if you want, that determines the treatment. And of course, there is a healthy temperament and there is an illness temperament. There are 9 temperaments, as you can see, the 4 of them and the combinations. And then the humors, that's what's really challenging to understand because we don't think that way anymore. So the word humor is derived from the Latin humor, which is fluid, but in Arabic it termed khalt, which means mixture. So Avicenna described the humors as the liquid substances that are formed from food. And it's the balance of these humors that constitutes health. And that's what we call today the homeostasis, is that balance of the body. The temperament is the net result of the proportions of the 4 humors. Again, here are the humors with their characteristics and their elements. And that's how it was described by Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna. So here are the 4 of them and the phenotypes. So these are the constitutions of every person, if you want, categorized in these 4 different categories. And we still use them today. We describe a person as choleric, as phlegmatic, as melancholic, and as sanguinaire. So that's if we use that diagram and we put the temperaments, there on that, the humors, and then the phenotype. So this is a summary basically of what I have been talking about. The spirits, this is very important because there is always this kind of mixing, the spirit with the mystic, with the theological spirit. But here, the way it's described in Avicenna, these are not the theological and mystical ones. The spirits are purely physical and they represent the energies of life. How to translate that? So Avicenna defines the spirit as light objects that exist in the air, and they are the driving forces that help the faculties carry out their functions and connect between them. So basically, it's the life force. So that's how he described the spirits. The spirit has 2 parts, the Pneuma and the Ignis. The Pneuma is the breath, and the Ignis is the fire. It's the heat. And the Ignis doesn't exist without Pneuma. And according to Unani teachings, each organ needs its specific spirit to function. That's the term of spirits, not one spirit. And the way we know science today and medicine, this makes perfect sense that every organ has its own spirit. And I can talk more about later in the discussion if we have questions about that. Biomedicine. Biomedicine is basically moving from the humors or the humor concepts to the cell. Now we understand science at the cellular molecular level, and this is a diagram of a cell with a very important organelle, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and of course it becomes the powerhouse of the body. It's called the mitochondria, and I want you to remember this name here, ATP. So here is the mitochondria, and we remember what Avicenna said about the spirit and about the ignis that occurs in the same organs as pneuma, and each organ needs its specific spirit. So that's what it means. When we look inside this organelle, when the oxygen is in the cell, there is this transformation of, there is generation of energy. The cells start making energy, and the result also is water. So basically that happens at every second, if you want, in the cell, generation of energy and water. And that's when he said life is sustained by heat and grows by moisture. Mitochondria is at the center of a lot of debate these days in the past 20 years, as it is now known for it to be the cause of many diseases. As you can see here, every organ, basically almost every organ in the body is affected by the dysfunction of the mitochondria and causing disease. Now let's talk a little bit about prevention. That's what Avicenna said in the 11th century. The transition between seasons in every region induces a set of diseases that the physician should be aware of and prepared for it in order to prevent them. So they were really aware for, preventing the disease from happening. And the person may experience pain by watching another person with pain, and experience alteration of temperament by imagining a happy or sad matter. And that's what we are promoting these days. We call it imagery, meditation and imagery. And back then, he also mentioned that sleep strengthens the natural faculties because it retains and saves innate heat, that ATP that we talked about, and relaxes the psychological faculty by moisturizing, which is this water that's generated in the cell, making breath available and reducing evaporation. So just to give you what has been going on in the scientific sphere, that was a workshop that took place last year, 2020, on perfecting timing, circadian rhythms, sleep and immunity. It's an NIH workshop, and it's summarized in this publication. So now in the 21st century, we are giving that importance to sleep. I couldn't conclude this talk without mentioning what has been going on in the past 2-3 years when this first paper was published, talking about the new organ that was discovered in the body. They call it a new organ, which is the interstitium. And knowing what is written in Avicenna's book, he described back then the intercellular and intracellular fluids as secondary humors. So that's what they're talking about now in the 21st century. It's this lymph, this fluid that's between the cells. And the same thing, I mean, later in the 19th century, Claude Bernard also described the milieu intérieur, but it's until 2018 that it was on the Nature magazine as a new organ. Personalized medicine. That's what Avicenna said back then. Bodies may vary in their reaction to causes. The same cause may produce different diseases in different bodies, different disease at different times, and its effect varies among the strong and the weak, as well as among the sensitive and the very sensitive. I mean, in this sentence, the whole idea of personalized medicine of today and even precision medicine is summarized here. So we want to practice personalized medicine now, and that's what we want it to be. We stratify patients. We want to find for every patient the perfect treatment that fits exactly that same person. And that's what Avicenna was doing. So now let's see the element. We talked about elements, temperaments, patterns, basically, phenotypes. And what if we add to that the biosignatures, the biomarkers for personalized medicine. Is it achievable? I think it is, because the technology has moved so fast in that discipline of biomarkers. And you can see here all the databases. Now we know every single molecule in the body. I mean, almost. So what if we add to that diagram the genotype, which is now talking about biosignature and biomarkers? Basically, that's what Avicenna was talking about. Personalized medicine is today is finding the biosignatures of everyone. So in conclusion, we are moving towards medical practices in the 21st century that were described and successfully implemented centuries ago. These practices are energy-centric disease models. They are based on prevention and personalized and precision medicine. Thank you very much. And I'll stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amri. There's a lot there that we will discuss. No, a lot of good stuff there.
That was a marathon.
No, it was great. I actually have I mean, I know this, we're going to get to the Q&A portion, but I've written down quite a few questions. I will hold on to them, but I do want to say how interesting it is that in the modern age is what we're focusing on, stuff that Avicenna said in the 11th century, the importance of sleep, that new tissue, the personalized medicine. So that's really fascinating. Dr. Floor, I will give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I hope I will provide you with some interesting minutes. Can you show me the first slide, please? Oh, wonderful. Well, before, I think not everybody knows where Iran is, and let's make it clear, Iran before 1500 was, or let's say, was a much bigger place than after 1500. But to make things simple for everybody, let's say if we start at 1500, then you can say that the population, depending on the incidence of war, vary between 6 and 9 million. And then of that population, 80 to 90% was rural. And 95% of the total population was illiterate. Now, taking into account that they were rural, the communications between cities and between villages was very bad and expensive. So that had all implications for healthcare. And there was, of course, like in the rest of the world, a high incidence of disease and mortality. Next slide, please. Now, we have just talked about Avicenna, etc., and Tib al-Yunani, but in Iran were basically more or less recognized 3 different sources of knowledge. The most important one was folk medicine, Tib al-Sunnati. It was the oldest and the most important medical system. The second one, Tib al-Nabi, and later when Iran became more Shiite, the Shiites thought, well, we also need to have give more importance to the imams. You got Tib al-Aymer, that of the imams medicine, which was basically an attempt to domesticate Galenic and folk medicine, which were basically pagan in origin, by giving it a Muslim veneer. And then you had Galantic Medicine, or Tib al-Yunani, which was basically, despite the importance of Avicenna and others like him, the least important of the 3, although it still receives most of the attention. And we can talk about that. Next, please. Start with folk medicine. You know, what we should realize, Iranians until quite recent times basically lived in 2 worlds. One was the physical one, where you could see, feel, and smell everybody, and the other was the spiritual world, was populated with ghouls, goblins, thieves, jinns, ifrits, paris, and they were not all, let's say, nice spirits. There were also many malignant spirits. who had the evil eye, and it could happen, let's say, that even when you didn't know that somebody cast an evil eye on a person or an animal, chasm zadeh in Persian. As a result, certain disease is often ascribed to the evil eye. And the whole idea of evil eye was sanctioned by Islamic law because the Prophet Muhammad also had believed in evil eye, and therefore the sanction of charms, which were basically the most effective way to deal with spirits, was therefore also allowed. So widespread was this belief that fairies and demons had such a big role in people's life that they were almost as important, if sometimes not more important, than God and the Imams. And the fact, let's say, that the Quran and the Hadith and also this Islamic law confirms that the world is peopled with jinns, etc., makes this all more understandable. Next slide, please. Now, as I said, the Tibb al-Nabi, the prophet's medicine. Basically, let's say, as I said, Galantic medicine and folk medicine were pre-Islamic and pagan in origin, and therefore, let's say, very pious scholars thought, well, you know, in order to practice medicine, it needs to be sanctioned by religion, else it might be explained as something that is kufr or unbelief, and at the same time they wanted to offer an Islamic conceptual view of health, well-being, and illness. The result was, let's say, a mixture of old medicine, astrology, Afro-Syriac lore, personal hygiene, etc., and embroidered with Galenic concept and terminology. It never really played an important role, but it's sanctioned both other systems. It was a religion-based, not science-based system. And because the Quran has nothing basically to offer in terms of medical knowledge, apart from having faith in God, which is a very powerful sort of medicine. Recourse had to have with hadith, which doesn't have much either. Moreover, it constitutes problems. For example, one hadith says that, or look, there are a few versions of it, where the Prophet Muhammad clearly says, La adwa, which means, let's say, there is no contagion. And many scholars interpreted this, let's say, if, for example, Al-Razi and other scholars described, for example, smallpox and said it was a contagious disease, but others said, no, if you say that, it's kufr, unbelief. And in fact, in reality, when contagious diseases like plague and others broke out, Muslims did not heed the tenet of religious law that said you had to stay in place with no contagion. No, they fled from the infected areas. And there also was the other problem with this a problem innate to the hadith, the tradition literature, is that many of them are contradictory. Next one, please. Then we have Galantic medicine. We have an excellent presentation of how it was structured from Dr. Amri. And so I will not say much about it because it would be repetitious. I only would say, let's say that, as Dr. Amri also said, that there was a theoretical Nazari and practical medicine, Amali, but the two actually had nothing to do with each other. I mean, many studies have been done on this, despite, let's say, that Avicenna was indeed a man ahead of his time, but basically, let's say, his concepts and of other enlightened scholars like him really never played a role in the actual practice of medicine. And the learned medical treatises served other purposes than determining medical practice. And as a result, after say the 12th century, there was very little development of new ideas and insights in medical science in Iran, or for that matter in the Islamic world. Next slide, please. Although these three systems I have basically said as if they were separate, I mean, they was almost a seamless thing because they borrowed from each other, and it all depended on a lot of factors where you could be classed in one or the other one. But irrespective of which system there was practiced, they all believe strongly in supernatural cause, including those, let's say, manifested by the movement of celestial bodies or of academics and other forms of disease. That's all, whether it's, let's say, folk medicine or Galantic medicine. All three medicine recognized implicitly or explicitly two classes of remedies against disease, and Galantic medicine divided those in preservation of health and those that cured disease, which, I mean, makes perfect sense. Very important, all of them advised people to lead a religious, blameless and exemplary life, and above all, of course, pray, which was always very helpful. We should not forget, let's say, that despite the insights by people like Avicenna, etc., Persian physicians, or any physicians at that time, had no practical knowledge at all of anatomy, and surgery was hardly practiced and was basically restricted to bone setting, teaspooling, cauterization, and couching. This is for the eyes. Next slide, please. When we look, let's say, at actual medical practice, we can see three groups: spiritual healers, dead saints, denizens of the spirit world, magical and prayer doctors. Then you have the traditional healers, mainly female healers, barbers, bone setters, and surgeons. And then you had the Galenic physicians, who are basically, let's say, the general practitioners, eye surgeons, and druggists. I'll get back to them. Next slide, please. The spiritual healers. Well, the dead, let's say, like right now, the imams are there. You can go online and you can, if you have, let's say, know what your disease is, you can actually click on your disease and find which imams are there is the most helpful in getting rid of your problem, which is not new. I mean, throughout the ages, certain saints, dead or alive, by the way, were known for their specialty in a certain disease. Even nowadays, people, let's say, take water. Let's say when they go to an imam zaydah or a place for a saint, they gather the dust that is around the tomb and you make pills of them and use them in case they're ill. Or when the water is thrown over the railing around that, the water is gathered, etc. The spirits, I mean, very important. The Paris and Dives and Ifrits. When you go to, well, nowadays it's not practiced anymore, but not such a long time ago, even let's say 50 years ago, I have seen them. You had sacred trees where people hang in pieces of textile, etc., or had stone cairns in the villages and on the roads, basically to propitiate the spirits and do good deeds for them. There were also living spiritual healers like sheikhs, dervishes, sayyids, mullahs, the writers of prayers, soothsayers, magicians, etc., wise women, and there were quite a few of them in the towns, and they had a lot of clientele. And Persians believed in the healing powers of these people, and because they allegedly were endowed with magical life force, what's called dom or nafas. And it was quite common, let's say, that if you had a problem, that such a person would get close to you and breathe this nafas, this life force, into you, at the same time praying and do other things, and that should do the work. Europeans who noticed this and other placebo prescriptions that they were quite effective in many cases. Next slide, please. Now, as far as the Galantic physicians is concerned, I mean, I disagree there with Dr. Amri that even in, let's say, probably even in the days of Avicenna, his ideas were actually practiced by most physicians. In the first place, there were no proper, let's say, medical schools where you were trained in the training took usually place in the service of an existing physician, often was a family member, father, son, or uncle, and basically once he thought you were ready to go, he gave you an ijazah, a permit to practice. Diagnosis, let's say, despite the slide that we saw of the practical medicine, what people did, usually there was no examination. The physician listened to the symptoms that were described, and based on that, he gave a prescription. At best, as we know from the actual prescriptions, they would feel the pulse, visually expect the swelling, or palpitate the abdomen for tumors. And then they would write a prescription, hand it to the relatives, and get and explained also how the dosage and how they should use it. Depending whether they had to pay him for the consultation, if not, then he often was paid for the prescription and the drugs, because they also often had their own pharmacy. Otherwise, they were sent to the herbalist, the attar, who were available all over town and sold herbs and also gave medical advice. Then you had a very special class of eye surgeons. Many of them, in fact, if not the majority, were women. Basically only two types of intervention, using caustics on the eyes and couching, which is basically with a needle going into the eye. The failure rate was very high, and the people were usually not better off. Next slide, please. Then you had, let's say, other traditional healers. The most important one was the barber, and who had basically the monopoly of dentistry, phlebotomy, which is taking blood, and cautery, the branding, and he also performed the circumcision. I have put the bone setters and the surgeon there are separately. Often the barber did the same. The bone setters basically had, as they had no knowledge of anatomy, when they were adjusting displaced bones, etc., often caused more problems than they solved. The surgeons usually were basically engaged in bleeding, in plastering wounds, cupping, applying moxa on hurting parts, cautery, open an abscess, etc. And as European doctors said, to be avoided at all cost. Then also very important, women, mostly midwives, were actually the primary healthcare givers for the majority of the rural and urban population. I mean, we all get the impression that, you know, this whole thing is whole healthcare in Iran, or for that matter in the Middle East, was a male-dominated. No, not at all. Mostly were women practicing folk medicine, and in particular, of course, for women and children, which were already the majority of the population. Next slide, please. Now we come to the beginning of modern medicine. It took some time. Usually people say it started with the establishment of the Darul Funun, which was established in 1851. But despite the fact that medicine was taught there as a subject, we have to realize that the people who came there had usually incomplete education, and in some cases I'm putting that mildly. And so at best it could be called a high school. And as a result, let's say, it doesn't know physicians were trained. At best, they were nurse assistants. It was only, let's say, only in 1921, when a more rigorous curriculum and work program was established, that there was the beginning made towards really practical modern medicine. The real School of Medicine was established in 1885 by the American Presbyterian missionaries in Urmia, which produced competent physicians who not only had the thorough theoretical knowledge, but also practical experience in hospital and dispensary care, as well as performing operations. They were basically trained to get an American physician's diploma, and many of them, in fact, later also worked in the United States. Let's say, to give you an idea how slow modern medicine advanced in Iran, in 1924, a total of 905 doctors were licensed to practice in Iran. Of these, only 253 had a diploma. The number includes European and American doctors working in Iran. And then the remaining 652 had been authorized to practice, basically because they had already at least 5 years experience and the government just grandfathered them. But of these 652, very few had any notion of modern medicine, although they enjoyed a good reputation. And then of these 905, a total of 323 practiced only in Tehran. So that, excluding Tehran, there was only one doctor per 16,800 inhabitants in 1924. The corresponding figure in Iran was 680. And we should realize, let's say, that despite the presence of Western trained doctors, European doctors, and quite a few modern hospitals in the larger cities, the most important healthcare givers were still the folk medicine. Because, let's say, in the first place, the Galantic trained physicians, and we can talk about later about their training, was a very small number. Now, if you take into account, and I draw your attention to the first slide, that 80 to 90% of the people lived in rural areas, you can understand that they never had any access to these Galantic. If you had, let's say, even 100 in one large city of, say, 50,000, you can see that even there, they could not treat everybody. They didn't, because they mainly treated the wealthy, and the other people just had to do with the mainly female, as well as the Sayyids and the mullahs and the other people who also practice folk medicine. Next, please. Okay, the conclusion. So the Islamization of Galantic and folk medicine was enabled by the Tib al-Nabi, the Prophet's medicine, which provided the Islamic framework to bring daily practice and reality within the Islamic fold. The tension that in particular existed in the beginning, in the 11th century, between Galantic medicine and Islam, thereafter disappeared, and the two coexisted seamlessly. Folk medicine provided the majority of the population with medical care, and it still plays a role nowadays, just like in the rest of the world, by the way. Its illiterate practitioners ignored Western medicine. They couldn't read, and they had no access to it, although many of them adopted the odd Western drug and practice into their arsenal, as they had done centuries earlier with Galantic medicine. For example, the idea of hot, cold, dry, humid, male, female, etc. The literate practitioners of Galantic medicine, although a very small minority, opposed Western medicine because they saw it as a dangerous competitor. However, they started to use Western medicine and methods because even if they opposed it and its drugs, they could not deny the latter's effectiveness. More medical care and surgery provided by medical missionaries and British physicians in hospitals paved the way for modern healthcare in Iran as we know it. Modern medicine remained limited to a small part of society, even, let's say, as late as 1950. Even the application of vaccination campaigns remained limited in size initially, as did other preventive measures, such as public hygiene. It was only in the 1950s that large-scale campaigns to eradicate endemic diseases were initiated, And that battle was only won in the 1970s. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Floor. I know that we have some questions in our Q&A, but I do have a couple questions that I myself am going to pose. The first is for Dr. Amri. In how did Avicenna know all of this in the 11th century? And he had work that has survived since that, but medicine today, with your example of the importance of sleep, the new tissue and the personalized medicine are just now coming to fruition. Is Avicenna valued in Western medicine as much as he is in Eastern medicine? Oh, you're on, yeah.
This is a multifold question, and I'll try my best to answer. So yes, how did he realize all this in the 10th, 11th century? It's based on observation. And he was, he was a genius of his time, and he was just very observant. And the other thing is that if you read the ancient texts, let's say the Ebers Papyrus, which if one day you go to Germany, it's in the museum in Leipzig. In that papyrus from ancient Egypt, there is a very detailed description of a breast tumor in a man. So that knowledge is there. And that's why I wanted to really emphasize that knowledge is really built upon it. Knowledge in these different parts of the world didn't develop in a vacuum. So it built, it's really built on each other's knowledge. And let's say, so that's one, which is the ancient Ebers Papyrus. Then if you take the example of Dioscorides, Dioscorides was he was the physician of the Roman army and traveling with them across the Mediterranean and collecting the herbs and using them on the injured soldiers. So it's also observation. So in the Materia Medica, there are like hundreds of plants that have been in that repertoire. And Avicenna knew about this Materia Medica, so it was translated and he added to it. The scholars from the medieval time added to that knowledge. So it's really built on what was known from before. So the other question, I think it was twofold. I don't
Yes.
answer.
Does Western medicine value Avicenna as much as Eastern medicine?
It is this is a very good question. Avicenna's book, The Canon of Medicine, let's say, as I said, it's built on what was available there. I mentioned the Ebers Papyrus, but there is also the Corpus of Medicine, which is the Bible book of Hippocrates. And that what was used, to kind of practice medicine then from Hippocrates to Dioscorides to Galen, etc. So the corpus of medicine of Hippocrates was also used as the foundational kind of, knowledge. Now, is Ibn Sina well known or Purusina well known in the West? Yes. And his book was translated, the Canon of Medicine was translated before even the Greek writings, and edited 14 times, used until the 17th century in the European universities to teach medicine. Mm. And then this humoral medicine kind of faded away because the technology that was developed, the new observations, Pasteur and, all these different discoveries. So this kind of got put aside. Now, is it as ignored? I don't think so, because you saw the postal stamps from all these different countries that commemorated the millennial of his birth. So he's well known. And there are movies, actually, if you are interested in cinema, there are movies about Ibn Sina. The latest, it's not named in Ibn Sina, but from 4 or 5 years ago, I think it's called The Physician. And it kind of, shows a little bit of that, monumental work and the person, Avicenna.
Excellent, thank you. And you both mentioned how Avicenna was a genius, was ahead of his time. My question to Dr. Floor, and please jump in as well if you would like to add, Dr. Amri, is how was Avicenna treated in his time? Was he revered? Was he seen as a genius in his time? And secondarily to that, you mentioned the folk medicine, the prophet medicine, the Galenic medicine. How did Avicenna manage to focus on science-based medicine without offending the other medicines of the time?
Well, Avicenna, like let's say he lived in a time where scientific research was not only allowed but was stimulated, and it was like Dr. Amri said, it was based on observation and by very clever people. The point is, let's say that yes, he was of course not only very well known and revered. It was so bad that in the 12th century, the author of the Chahar Makhale wrote that those people who dare to criticize Avicenna should be, I can't remember the exact quote, but let's say, should be punished and thrown in prison. And that's the interesting thing, let's say, that you see that that after the wave of free exercise of scientific research, you have a counter wave, which coincided, let's say, not only, let's say, it was not only happening in medical science, it coincided, let's say, with other branches of science, including religious sciences. And the most important event was the closure of the Bab al-Ijtihad, let's say, the free exegesis of the Quran and the Hadith, etc., which also happened at that time. And so what we see is, let's say, that yes, he was very important as a developer of theoretical concept, etc. But at the same time, quite a few studies have done in that area. The practical application thereof basically was almost irrelevant. Also, not only because, let's say, the number of physicians that were able to read the stuff, because in the first place it was much of it was in Arabic, what was written by Razi and Ibn Sina, etc. And so the number was very small. But secondly, as I said, 90% of the population was illiterate, lived in rural areas. So it was, I would say, it was like throwing pearls before swine.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to look to our Q&A of our audience, and one of them says, can you please talk about the concept of quarantine, which I've heard was first addressed by Avicenna?
Well, let's put it this way. Quarantine was not a concept that I would refer people to my book on studies in the history of medicine. I have a whole chapter on quarantine there. It was a foreign concept. Basically, it was imported from Europe, and it basically refers to the quarantine, 40 days that you had to be isolated in order to be sure that you were not infected. But as I said, there is this lad where, said the prophet. And so basically all the medical scientists who wrote about it, even when they recognized that some diseases were contagious, had to admit that, well, there is this canonical utterance of the prophet. And so, and even some went so far that propagating quarantine and let's say the idea of contagion itself was koffer or unbelief.
Dr. Amri, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'm not a historian, as you have realized by now. I'm more of a biochemist, and but I tend to read, and I love reading about the history of medicine. There is a paper that came out, within this pandemic, the COVID pandemic and all that. There are several writings actually from Persia, from Iran in particular, from very, very good researchers. And they reported actually on how Amrad al-Waba, which is the infectious diseases, have been described in the canon of medicine, and also by Al-Razi in Kitab al-Hawi. So there are papers that I'm happy to share with the audience. I'm happy to share them. So this is this one, Understanding COVID. I have a slide if you want to, I can show. Let me share my screen because I prepared it and then the time was really, yeah. So do you see it?
Yes.
Yes. So these are two papers that and there is more, honestly, in the literature since 2019, 2020. So these are two papers. One is Understanding COVID-19 in the Light of Epidemic Disease, described in Unani Medicine. And it goes through all, the different kind of protocol, if you want, the way we call it today, the protocol of isolation, of clean air, of, good food, of preserving the vital organs. So this is in that paper. And the second paper here, which is a beautiful review that was just published also in 2020, November 2020, on the evaluation of traditional Persian medicine for the management of COVID. And in that paper, in that review of basically 20 pages, they went through the whole protocol, especially the treatment, the herbal treatment. And what I like about this one in particular is that they went through these herbs and their studies, the mechanisms, how they work, and how they have been tested in the animal model, in human, clinical trials. It's a beautiful review. I'm happy to share those with the audience.
Excellent. Yes, please. Another question we have, I'm just getting through a couple, so I apologize if we don't get to your question, but one for Dr. Amri, and then I will do one for both of you. One is, Dr. Amri, what was your motivation by translating Avicenna's book from Arabic to English?
Oh, okay. The motivation was there since I was 11, I think. And it happened that at that time, when I was 11, 12, my grandfather was hospitalized at the University Hospital in Constantine, my hometown in Algeria. And he was in the internal medicine ward. And that building where they have the internal medicine department, that building is called, even today, Ibn Sina. So everybody knows that building, Ibn Sina, in the University Hospital. And I grew up, back then when Algeria was more kind of, leaning towards the Francophonie. So there's street names, buildings were all, after French doctors and Rue du Docteur Lavran, and so I was intrigued by that name because it didn't sound familiar when I was, young. And I started really kind of thinking about it and reading about it. And more I read, and the more I got intrigued, and the more I got interested. And when the opportunity, presented itself a few years ago of, translating the volumes of the canon. I mean, I went through just the first one with my co-authors, but so when the opportunity was there, I just jumped on it. And then I realized that there weren't, to my knowledge, direct translations directly from Arabic into English. So I think this is one of the very first ones directly from Arabic. I mean, being an Arabic speaker, I think it's, yeah, I didn't hesitate a second.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. The next question I will ask Dr. Floor, and then I said I will pose one to both of you. One says, this is a critique of your statement saying there was no useful practical implications and use of medicine back in the day because there were no X-rays or MRIs. And there seems, do you believe that is that what you said? And
No.
I didn't think that's what you said. But okay, I'm going to move on from this question.
So let's give you a very simple example. Let's say the two articles that Dr. Amri just showed about COVID and the ideas that Razi and Ibn Sina had about contagious diseases. These ideas were never implemented in practice. I mean, and I can, if people are interested, I can refer them to studies that have shown, let's say, that the very theoretical studies that were done, and Dr. Ami is quite right that some of them are very insightful and useful. They were not had no function in healthcare. That's the thing. The two, theory and practice, were two different things.
Understood.
It reminds me when once 1975 was in India. I wasn't because you didn't mention that I actually am an energy specialist. Worked for 20 years for the World Bank on that. I was in India, and I was at an institute where a scholar and a scientist had developed very interesting solar things that could be used in villages. So I asked him, what did the villagers think? And he said to me, "Sir, I'm a scholar." Yes, that was also my reaction.
So they didn't ask the villagers.
Yes, and I think that's the way it was with the development of the theoretical, and it may well be, let's say, although we don't know, because much of the information about the actual practice, how Ibn Sina and Razi and Giorgiani and the others work, is from the 13th century. And basically by two Syrian physicians themselves, and if you read their book, even the stories that they tell contradict each other sometimes. So
I didn't understand very well the question, so I don't know if you can repeat it.
It was more of a comment on the practical applications that Avicenna had in his time. And then the next question I have, will, I think both of you please join in. At the time of Avicenna, did religion of the time encourage medical and scientific advancement in Iran, or was it a bottleneck compared to advancement taking place in Europe? Did Avicenna get the support of the ruling institution? I'm gonna pass this out to Dr. Floor because I think you mentioned something.
No, at the time, as I said earlier, at the time there was a political and scientific contact. It was very positive. about the development of new ideas. And you know, in the 11th century, you had the Abbasid Caliphate based in Baghdad, but at the time were an Iranian dynasty, the Buyids, were basically in charge, and they were very supportive of this idea. And they were also among those who established hospitals. We can talk about hospitals. I've written a book about that, but that's as a story. Yes, there was no religious hindrance as yet, but at the same time, I should say, and in the 11th and 12th century, yet also the rise of the formulation of the Tib al-Nabi, where basically, let's say, pious ulama thought that the body of knowledge, of medical knowledge, should be dressed up in Islamic habit.
Mm.
Mhm.
For the next question, thank you, Dr. Fleur. For the next question, we have gotten a few questions about women in medicine during the time, and a question about children's medicine of the time. I know that in your slide, Dr. Fleur, you mentioned that a lot of that was deferred to midwives, but in Avicenna's research, was it male focused? Did it encompass women as well as and children, or who was he studying when he made his observations?
Well, being a male, of course, he was basically limited to women, although sometimes there was slippage. But as I said, the Galantic or the W90 was the least important of the system. It was the folk medicine that had always, since time immemorial, the most important. I mean, every housewife had a few ideas about how to treat their children. And in the village, there was, let's say, a wise woman who did it. And if there was not a wise woman, there was a Sayyid or a holy man, however you define that. And given the fact, let's say, that people believed in the how shall I put it, extraterrestrial origin of disease. If a holy man or a knowledgeable woman whom you trusted gave you guidance how to deal with that, that was half of the healing process. Don't forget, even nowadays, as studies have shown, the use of placebos gives a success ratio of 40%. So in that respect, let's say, it's quite normal that, let's say, folk medicine was also had a high success. Don't forget this, given the high mortality, infant mortality rate, if you survive the first 5 years, my God, you are a robust person. I mean, it took a lot of dirty diseases to kill you.
Dr. Amri, yes.
Yeah, I just want to add that women in medicine from that time, I wish I could read more languages than just, Arabic and French, to hopefully find that women contributed a great deal into this body of knowledge. The other aspect of, Avicenna talking about women, yes, there are descriptions in the canon of medicine about women's health, about diseases that are attributed, to the diseases that affected women. One of them that I read about also is the fibroids, the uterine fibroids, for example, were described, not named as such, because that's the new terminology that we know of, but this waram or swelling is described in the canon of medicine, swelling in the uterus, swelling, al-rahim, waram al-rahim. And They describe also, tumors in the breast. They describe, so they knew about the diseases that were affecting women at the time. And the other thing is that in the canon of medicine, he, again, maybe from a theoretical perspective, and Avicenna, he talks really well about the stages of life and the treatment for the different stages of life. The temperament of a kid, a child, is different than the temperament of the same child when he or she become, teenagers, an adult, and then elderly. So very aware of these stages of life, very aware of these changes. So basically, the description is from the baby all the way to the elderly. So it goes through this spectrum, and that's what's beautiful about his, compendium of the canon of medicine. It really talks about all these aspects of life and health and the dynamic, body, and the dynamic disease and the seasons and where you are, if you are in the tropics or temporal regions. So it's all in there. I just want to clarify one thing. When I mentioned theoretical and practical, that's the way we study medicine today also. It's the theory, it's the first 2 years of medicine, and these are called the preclinical years. So that's when biochemistry and physiology and pathology and histology are taught, and it's exactly the same way. And the practical is when the students move from the preclinical years to the clinical years, and that's the practical. So the theoretical and practical is the way medicine has been organized and systematized back then already. And that's the same model we use today. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we are about to come on time, and so I have last couple of questions. I'm going to do a two-parter. The first is folks want to know if either of you have ever been to Iran. And the second is, Dr. Amri, you talk about homeostasis, or what Avicenna said was homeostasis, what we call that today. Did he believe that homeostasis could be achieved in the body, or was the goal preventative health, like ultimately preventative healthcare?
Okay. So the first one, I've never been to Iran, and one of my wishes is to go visit one day. I love countries with ancient cultures, and I love, visiting, old cities and ruins, I would love to do that one day. Second, yes, what we call today homeostasis is the balance. And he, in the canon of medicine, or in the book of Razi, or, in Hippocrates, they talk about the balance of the humors. They didn't know it's called homeostasis. And until Walter Cannon kind of coined that word of stress and homeostasis. So he knew that the humors need to be balanced in order to, correct these temperaments and in order to diagnose. So the diagnosis and the treatment are based on this imbalance between the humors. So homeostasis, the way we talk about it today, is, in my opinion, no different than when they talk about the balance of the humors.
Thank you. Dr. Floor, have you been to Iran, and any closing
yes,
remarks?
The first time that I came to Iran was in 1966, and the last time in 2017.
Wow.
In between, I've been there many times. I have crisscrossed the country. I have been in places that most Iranians never have been.
Lucky you.
And I even been in the Dasht Kavir. So yeah, I think I know the country a little bit. Yes, and I think I can recommend everybody to go there. And not only that, but they are very hospitable and very friendly people. As I said in 2017, when I returned from my last trip, and people asked me about it, and I said, you know, the government of Iran may not like the US, but the people of Iran are probably the only ones in the Middle East who like Americans.
Well,
That's a good one.
yeah. I know I said the last one was the last one, but I think this last question will actually tie everything together in that where does Iranian medicine stand today? Especially in comparison with other countries in the region. For example, Iran has developed its own COVID vaccine, but neighboring countries have not.
Oh, Iranian medicine is very advanced. You have quite a few people who are at the highest level compared with other people in the world, whether it's in brain neurosurgery, for example, the very famous surgeon, or in other fields. I mean, if I compare it, if I compare Iran when I first saw it in 1966 with right now, I mean, it's like you visit a different planet. It has been transformed totally. It's also very much a country that is highly high tech, and so yes, they are second to none in that respect.
Okay, Dr. Amri?
Yeah, I think the way it stands, Iranian medicine today is the way I see it in the literature, in the modern literature. There is a lot coming out of there. Beautiful studies, really top-notch, research, and especially in the field I'm talking about, traditional Persian medicine, Unani medicine. They are doing, as I mentioned, these reviews that I shared with you. They are really top quality, and there is a lot of scholarly activity going on, and we will see more and more of that. So, yeah, yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you both so much. On behalf of the Persian Studies program, I thank you, Dr. Amri and Dr. Floor, for taking time to join us today in this thought-provoking conversation. I would love to let our audience know that both of them have agreed to make their presentations available, so we will be sending that out. Thank you to our audience for joining us and for all of your questions, for your participation, for your continued support in our events. Today's event was recorded and will be available on the Persian Studies website in the coming days. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.